Welcome everyone as you're entering, and welcome everybody. We're just letting people in the door now at just after 7. Thank you very much for coming to Waterfront for All Speaker Series 13. Villiers Island. Hang on a minute. Let's take a second look at the plan. I'm Edward Nixon from the Waterfront for All board. I'm joined this evening from Waterfront for All by Ed Hoare, our chair, and our board secretary Ron Jenkins, and other members of our board who are in attendance this evening. And it's my pleasure to welcome first, as our first panelist to speak, Norm. Norm, could you, I will spotlight you.
Thank you. I'll share my screen here.
Yeah, so just take it away.
Thank you very much, everyone, for making the time. And as Edward so rightly put, I look forward to a constructive discussion tonight. I just wanted to put together a quick primer for those who aren't necessarily up to date on Villiers Island, its importance, its context. So just walking through a brief history and explain a bit of why it matters and why it matters to me personally. So just to situate yourself a little bit, so here we have the DVP, and then the North Keating precinct, and then as we go across the channel here, this is Villiers Island. And then going further south, we have more of the Portlands. Now, this here is the Don River, which is part of a major project to renaturalize the mouth of the Don. So the Don kind of goes at a right angle right now, and this effort underway is to renaturalize the mouth of the Don so that we can be more resilient against flooding. So right now, unfortunately, when it floods, this whole area here is completely at risk of, essentially, can rough in some spots in a bad flooding incident, it could all go right underwater. So, the renaturalizing of the mouth of the Don, as well as some of the wetlands around Villiers Island and other parts here, are helping to make us more resilient against that flooding and allow for housing where housing simply wouldn't have been possible before. So this is kind of that exciting opportunity, kind of a blank slate, which is Villiers Island, which is one of the few opportunities of this magnitude in the city of Toronto, where we're kind of starting from no housing and building up to something. This is another look at Villiers Island from sort of more of a built form sort of look, and just gives you hopefully a better idea of its context within the city. And some quick facts. So Keating Channel to the north, Inner Harbor to the west, Polson Slip to the south, and the Don Roadway to the east. The entire Villiers Island is roughly 98 acres. About 48 of those is developable area, including streets and sidewalks. And then currently 50 acres are parks and green spaces. And you might be able to make some inroads there, but it's worth keeping in mind that that is a floodplain, and that's why it's part of why we have so much green space there, which by the looks of it is going to be spectacular. This is, I think, a key thing to highlight. We're talking about a 30-minute walk from Villiers Island to downtown. So, it's one of the last great opportunities downtown to actually build a significant amount of housing and, just a whole community really out of thin air, as it were. So the Villiers Island Precinct Plan, which was developed in 2017 with the help of Urban Strategies, it had some kind of guiding concepts. Including the island as a gateway. They're hoping to get a lot of tourists there. I think the estimate was something like 1.5 million. Sort of recognize the area's industrial heritage, prioritize pedestrian, cycling, and transit infrastructure, which sounds pretty great, and a mixed-use inclusive community, and a variety of building forms. Some key policy priorities from that precinct plan, and whether or not all of these still make sense in the context of the housing crisis we find ourselves in, is open to discussion. But this sounds great: maximize the provision of housing and affordable housing, minimize shadow impacts. The shadows, I think that one might be open for some discussion, and what we're willing to tolerate there to perhaps bring in some more homes. Try to figure in the wetlands. They do have some plants that need sun at a certain time. And climate positive community also sounds great. Conservation of heritage resources and respect for key views, I think, is another area that might be open for some flexibility and discussion. So the approved plan from 2017 called for about 4,800 units or so. And, you're looking at a lot of sort of mid-size sort of structures at the time. It was just a different context when we think about 2017 versus really the kind of red alert housing crisis we find ourselves in now. It was just a bit of a different context and a bit of a different approach at the time. It's, as you can see here, it's a fairly typical city grid, and whether or not this is going to stay this way is, the roads and the buildings have not yet been like fully designed. So that's worth keeping in mind. So there's been a lot of direction from City Council through this process, and as we get towards current day, to try to focus and enhance and add more affordable housing. So you can see a list of motions that Councillor Fletcher largely has brought to City Council. And Councillor Fletcher actually has a motion that is going to help inform the report in next month to address some kind of outstanding questions, like, are there any height restrictions actually due to the island airport? And I really strongly hope that answer is no. Adding additional housing, this SROC site is a heritage structure that they've moved over. Is there opportunity to add housing there? Can we optimize the right of way widths? I think these are good questions to try to optimize what we have at the site. So look forward to seeing how this goes. Post the Villiers Island density study that was done this year, we're looking now at approximately 8,500 to 9,000 units island-wide, and with an estimated amount of 2,700 affordable housing rental units. Whether or not that math all adds up, I'm sure some other speakers are going to address. There was a question on Twitter about community facilities and services, so I thought I'd include the slide to help answer that question. There's a community center and a school that are planned, and quite a few childcare facilities, a library and a fire station. And I hope most of these are podiums on some sort of building above them. And yeah, there's going to be, as you can see around the border here, a significant amount of parkland, and some of that is to help prevent flooding. So wetlands and things that can absorb that flooding, so that these new neighborhoods don't flood. So yeah, there were proposed changes to the precinct plan, increase housing and advance affordable housing targets of 30%. In terms of where we're going from here, there's going to be zoning bylaw and plan amendments coming. I believe it's in the June meeting actually. That's coming up, and then some more important Indigenous engagement, including the new name for Villiers Island, whatever that happens to become. And then, phasing implementation plans, probably more detail on the roads, buildings, et cetera, over the next 12 months. So why does this matter to me? I see this as like a blank slate, an opportunity to elevate and enhance city building. When I first saw the plans for the Queens Quay revitalized street, which actually came out of an international design competition, which I think never hurts if you want to get the best ideas from around the world. I fell in love with the waterfront when I saw this. They had mocked it up in 2002 with some sort of bike lanes made by planters, and I was just like, wow. Like I can cycle around the city and feel safe and protected, and they're considering all of these different things. It felt pretty like advanced for the time, and I would just like to see us kind of think about where the puck is going, to quote Wayne Gretzky, rather than where the puck is right now, as we think forward to the Villiers Island ultimate plan. But I just see as a great opportunity that we shouldn't miss. Obviously we're in the middle of a housing crisis, and City Council has a target of 285,000 new homes, and we could make quite a dent with Villiers Island if we play our cards right. And this is this came right from a Waterfront Toronto side. This is a once in a generation opportunity. Why not just make sure that we've got it right and we've optimized everything? Maybe we get some of the best ideas from around the world, maybe an international competition or something. But I just wouldn't want to see us miss this opportunity to create something spectacular that also helps us, contributes towards solving the housing crisis that we have in our city. And then just a quick throwback to 2014. I've been talking about the Portlands for about 10 years. This was actually an argument we put forth to not allow jets to fly at the island airport because we were thinking about the Portlands and Villiers Island and how these would become the future of our city. So I have a significant personal investment and stake in seeing this come to fruition and actually become the future of Toronto. You know, that's a 30-minute walk to downtown Toronto. Like that is just incredible. I just want to see us to get this opportunity right. And that's actually the end of my deck. I hope that was helpful to some.
Thank you very much, Norman.
My
I really
pleasure.
appreciate that. Thank you. Thanks for helping set the scene for us. And if you just, thank you, brilliant. So now it's my pleasure to turn to Eric Lombardi, and I will spotlight you, Eric. And Eric comes to us this evening from the advocacy group More Neighbors Toronto, and which why don't you tell us a little bit about that? You can go ahead, please, Eric.
Yeah. So More Neighbors Toronto was started back in 2022, and the purpose of the organization is really to raise the debate on the benefits of housing for a city that is afflicted with a generational housing crisis. And so really the objective is to help people understand that there are actually costs and consequences when we don't build housing, and particularly on those who rent, those who are younger, new residents. But I mean, it does impact all residents of the city because, you know, I fundamentally believe in this principle called the housing theory of everything. And I think one of the reasons why our society is struggling to, produce economic growth, to have additional capacity in our healthcare system, to attract teachers and doctors and service workers who actually enable our society to function well, is that we have been really driving down collective living standards as a result of this housing crisis. And in a lot of ways, modern planning has been a tool used by those who would subvert the necessary growth that our society needs in order to ensure that we have ongoing rising living standards. And so More Neighbors Toronto has really brought particularly a lot of young people into the conversation by facilitating just knowledge of when events are happening, but also making sure that we are delivering a message to all levels of government in a way that I think sometimes either industry, professional associations, and other civil society organizations might not be able to sort of challenge the objectives there. And to me, what's really important about Villiers Island and the Portlands in general is that we have an enormous blank slate to do city building and urban planning a bit differently than we have done for the last 20 years. We also have a huge opportunity to offer a release valve in housing demand, particularly around downtown, because of this proximity. And Villiers Island is just one component of a much larger geographic area that is the Portlands, for which planning the entire area is, in my opinion, also coming along a bit brutally slowly. And the important part about this conversation around Villiers is, how do we get Villiers right, but more importantly than right, how do we get it better than what's currently being planned? And then number two, how do we ensure that the conversation around Villiers helps inform us about how we can build out the rest of the Portlands in a way that supports not just our housing objectives, but others around active and use of public transportation, so more car-free living, our environmental goals, trying to get to sustainable neighborhoods, and to once again really reflect on the fact that the city itself is supposed to be a growing place with lots of opportunities. And I do think that some of our conversations around growth and housing don't necessarily allow us to have this big picture view. The other thing I'd mention, and I think this is a criticism that comes to either me or my neighbors a lot, is that we're in favor of more development. But I think in a lot of ways, we see a lot of new development in our city, and people get upset because in a lot of ways, there's been a lot of projects that have sanitized streetscapes. They have failed to make themselves places. And I live in the Canary District, which is just north of this. And I think a lot of things were done well, but there are also in many ways, some obvious misses in the urban realm, the retail realm, what we could do around housing. I mean, I think every building here is surrounded on all four sides by a road that I think reflect the urban planning mindset of 25 years ago. And I'm eager to not make that mistake again. So I'm gonna actually just share my screen. I'll open it up as well. There's been a lot of criticism levied at this plan. It has the classic straight block style development. There has been an upzoning on the western side of it to allow 35 to 44 stories in some buildings and 45 in others. But overall, the relative ambition for the number of residents who are going to live here remains low. Just for reference, the 8,000 to 9,000 units that are expected are anticipated to have about 15,000 residents. And to put that in the scale of economics to support, for example, a grocery store here, it's about half. A grocery store to open needs about 25 to 30,000 residents in the nearby area. So we're not really getting to a density level that would actually even support most grocery stores. So they might be able to get a smaller, more community-oriented market. But that also says things about the ability for retail and interesting places to be not in just the park, but actually in the urban environment here for residents, but also its ability to become a destination. Now, some of the limitations around density here are actually driven by some assumptions around transportation. There will be a Waterfront East LRT that will run down Cherry Street and then down Commissioners, and will rotate at the end corner here. But the assumption is that about 70% of the residents will take public transportation, about 20% will do active transportation, like biking or walking, and the remaining 10% by car. And that's where some of the important considerations even beyond Waterfront get in. So in all these criticisms, I wasn't necessarily seeing like what the alternative vision is. So I spent about a half an hour putting together, let's call it like a more neighbors vision for what this can look like. And what's important to me in talking about this, and it's a much denser proposal than the last one, but I believe you'd get to about 30,000 residents in the built form here that is being proposed. But it's not just the built form that I think matters in the context of what Villiers can be.
I can't follow what.
The first one being,
Pardon me 1 second, Eric.
Yeah.
Pardon me 1 second. Sorry, can you please mute yourselves? Please, if you're not participating in the meeting at this point, presenting, could you please kindly make sure you're muted? Thank you very, very much. We do have over almost 120 people here this evening. And I am going to run through our participant list just to make sure, but thank you kindly. Sorry to interrupt you, Eric, but yes, please do mute yourself if you're not currently speaking. Thanks so very, very much. Back to you.
So additional density supports more housing, but it also supports additional unit economics that allow us to unlock different kinds of housing, not from just market oriented. And I'm sure Mark Richardson will talk about the economics and math of making non-market affordable housing work. But a big part of it is enabling density. The first thing that we need to do to enable density is bring rapid transport close by to the area. And one of the, I think, big parts of the discussion around the Ontario line, which is going to run just to the north of Villiers Island and Keating Channel, is the Ontario line. And we have decided that we're not going to be building a station at that location, despite many reasons why it would make sense. Additionally, this is on the GO rail line for Lakeshore East. And so even if you were not to build an additional station for Ontario line, there is an opportunity to also build a station for GO. And with electrified service, that would be a very fast trip through to Union. And then beyond that, things I thought about that would make a place better is more pedestrian streets. I think we all would like to see more places that are car-free experiences for people to live in. We want to see better retail and more amenities to exist in the neighborhood. We don't just want to live in our condos. We want to live in a place. We want to live in excellent city. And one of the reasons why Toronto is expensive, particularly downtown, is that we're not creating the opportunities to live in an urban environment that are actually demanded by the market. You know, we've seen some excellent projects come through with the city as well, including the Well, which I have pictured on the left. And so I brought some of these concepts around plazas, density, covered malls, and you know, some of the, I'd say, canal places that I think have done a really job at becoming engaging. And so, you know, what I would like to propose to Waterfront Toronto is to really go beyond the current scope of the vision. I know there are private developments in here, etc., but you know, really think about how you make this a place that people want to come to and therefore need to be able to access in a relatively convenient way. And if you do so, you'll not only create demand for much additional density here, but you'll also create the unit economics to allow us to build a lot more other types of non-market housing in the same neighborhood so that it can be income diverse and vibrant and give people access to this beautiful park that we've been developing for, you know, a price of $1.7 billion, which, you know, spread out around that 9,000 units, would take over 30 years in the property taxes generated to pay it all back. So to me, you know, this is really just a proposal for how we can think about, well, how do we make this a place? How do we bring density? How do we make sure that that density is fun and good and people actually want to be able to live in it? So that's really my spiel. And you know, I'll be posting this thread online on Twitter probably tomorrow. So if people have thoughts or are even interested in exploring, you know, an additional concept like this in more detail, you know, I would love for that type of participation. So yeah, I'll wrap up.
Thank you very much, Eric. And if you could just, you'll want to share your screen in a second. And I have put a link to More Neighbors website in the chat, and I can put that in again if you, I can just put that in one more time for people who want to know more about the
work we do.
Community group that, yeah, there you are. And yeah, if you could just, if you shared your screen, Eric. Well,
yeah,
thank you so much.
Yes.
No worries. Thank you very much. And we've got it there. Yes. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. It's now my pleasure to turn to Blair Scorgie. Blair, I'm just going to spotlight you for everyone. Hi, Blair. So glad to have you with us. If you could, Blair, as I mentioned before, is a registered professional planner, lecturer at TMU. And why don't you start off by just telling us sort of how you came to be seized on this this evening so much.
No, well, thanks for that introduction. I'll caveat everything I have to say with, you know, an apology in advance if you hear my young children screaming in the background. It's bath time downstairs, and I am up above them in the loft, and my 2-year-old is in a mood. So I will do my very, very best not to have my own presentation interrupted by yelling and screaming, but I make absolutely no promises. So yeah, so again, thanks very much for that. I am a registered professional planner. I'm also an urban designer. I'm a consultant. I've got about 15 years of relevant consulting experience. Worked with a number of different companies over the years, and I've also got about 10 years of academic experience. I teach at TMU's School of Planning, where I teach primarily, you know, academic studio courses. And I'm interested in this for a number of reasons. I mean, and you know, without repeating everything that Norm and others have already said, I mean, this is a once in a generation opportunity, right? It's a clean slate. It's a major development. It's going to set a precedent, I think, in many respects for what we will expect to see in other precincts in the Portlands and the surrounding waterfront as those lands develop over the next 20, 30 plus years, right? So I think this is not the first phase, obviously, of the waterfront redevelopment. This is, you know, we're in the midst of the world's largest ongoing waterfront revitalization project, and it's absolutely incredible what Waterfront Toronto and the city and other stakeholders have managed to accomplish to date. But I'm interested primarily because of the opportunity presented by this particular project, being, you know, being fully transparent, I'm also, I live nearby. So I'm looking forward to visiting the new parks and the open spaces. And I would like to imagine a day where maybe I retire on this island and enjoy all of its very many benefits. So I'm a little selfish in that respect. I think this has incredible potential. I think we've gotten a lot of things right, and by we I mean the city, Creatio, Waterfront Toronto, etc. I think there are opportunities potentially to leverage all that work that's been done to date and make it even potentially even better. And I'm really excited for that possibility. So that's why I'm interested in this. And so what I add to the conversation, and please, team, feel free to cut me off if I go over 15 minutes. But what I'm really interested in here is, and I hope where I won't say I think, I'll say I hope where I add value is getting into a little bit more of the nuance from a planning and a design perspective, and providing a constructive critique of what I've seen. Okay, so, and you can take that for what you will. So without repeating everything that Norm has said, and without sort of preempting some of what I think Mark is planning on talking about, I'll provide some of that perspective. So on the density piece, it's been mentioned that the density is more than doubled. We're seeing a 60% increase in gross floor area relative to the original concept. We're now contemplating a plan that has 15,000 people, 3,000 jobs. If you were to sort of take that and look at it from the growth plan perspective, and look at it in terms of human density, that roughly equates to 454 persons and jobs per gross hectare. Now that's, of course, that's including all the parkland, the open space, et cetera, the streets. But that's a common metric that we look at. And so that to me is telling, because we were looking at roughly half of that with the original plan, which is maybe what you would expect to see around a subway station, a single subway station, in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. Now we're looking at the types of densities that you might expect to see in an urban center, albeit maybe not quite at the density you'd expect to see in downtown Toronto, which is where I think we're thinking there is maybe potentially even more opportunity. So I think all that to say, I think we're on the right track, right? And there may be opportunities to push things a little bit more. And I'll speak a little bit more about that in a minute. In terms of height and density, so the draft plan increases the number of towers, it increases the locations of the towers, and it increases the heights of the podiums and mid-rise buildings relative to the original plan. So that in and of itself is driving up the density, right? It also includes towers and blocks where there were previously no towers planned, where previously mid-rise and low-rise buildings were planned. It also contemplates, a height peak clustered around New Cherry Street and Munition Street, with intensification along Keating Channel, then transitioning downward sort of to the east of the eastern blocks, right, which are sort of remain largely sort of low to mid-rise in nature. So here's some thoughts on that. We could consider potentially, if there's a demand or desire to increase density, we could consider a scenario where we're increasing density on the east blocks a little bit more, given, and the rationale for that being that given that the heights of the densities that are contemplated for the East Harbor lands, the McCleary Heights district, and the Media City precinct to the east are higher, actually, directly across the river from what we're seeing in the east blocks. And so we're transitioning down, but then we're transitioning back up again immediately, and significantly so, particularly in respect to the East Harbor land. So there may be, maybe we should be revisiting that approach in terms of a height transition. So if there were a need for additional opportunity for density, that might be somewhere we could look for that. I also think because this is a blank slate, we could maybe consider the whole notion of the tower podium form. And we could also potentially look at, reducing tower separation distances. So the draft plan contemplates slender tower floor plates, plus or minus 750 square meters, which is generally consistent with what the tall building guidelines say for the City of Toronto. And there's also, I've heard from a couple of people, I think what I believe is a misconception of that this particular form is being demanded by the market. And I actually think it's the other way around. I think that we have created policies, regulations, and guidelines to dictate this form, and the market is responding. The guidelines were created essentially to ensure the contextually sensitive infill and intensification of development in existing built-up lands, but we're talking about a blank slate here. So I think we could kind of, for lack of a better word, or phrase, throw the guidelines out the window and think about what unique opportunities might present themselves in this particular context. So slender point towers are inefficient by design. I mean, they produce less desirable unit layouts. They increase the requirements for building height because you're only getting like 8 to 10 units per floor, right? And they don't necessarily lend themselves to the best layouts. You get these windy sort of corners, et cetera. And that in turn also increases the cost of housing. So, conversely, the linear forms of high-rise buildings that are more sort of reminiscent of the Toronto of the 1960s, 1970s, which we call, slab-like buildings, actually sort of lend themselves to more desirable unit layouts, a greater range and diversity of unit types, which are more in keeping with the types of units that the city is hoping to sort of see to accommodate families. We can achieve the same number of units or even potentially more units with fewer stories, right? So we don't need a 40-story point tower if you've got a 25-story slab building, right? So I think if there's concern about height, and I know that there is, and there's concern about, the landing sort of permissions at the airport and federal regulations around that. And if there's a desire to sort of keep things generally low from a design perspective, I think maybe we could start to think about a bit of a departure, if you will, from the conventional point tower podium form and moving towards maybe some sort of hybrid building type or something that sort of more closely resembles slab-like building forms. So I think that's something to consider. I know that Waterfront Toronto and the city are hung up on this 40-meter tower separation distance. I'd like to understand that a little bit better personally. But what I would say is, in the 905 municipalities of, say, Mississauga, Vaughan, Markham, et cetera, we tend to see tower separation distances of 30 to 40 meters. That's not uncommon. But in the city of Toronto and the tall building guidelines, we talk about 25 meters being appropriate. So I question that logic a little bit. But I would also say, conversely, that I think the issue of tower separation distance maybe becomes less of an issue if we can achieve more people in bigger buildings that are lower, right? Like if we have more slab-like buildings, we can accommodate a greater density of people and we can maintain that separation. We don't need as many buildings, we don't need as tall buildings, and we can maintain that separation, right? So I think right off the bat, I think that's something that we could look at. With respect to housing, about 80% of the island is in public ownership, which is amazing. It's an incredible opportunity. The remaining 20% is in private ownership. The city is committed to a target of 30% affordable housing on municipally owned lands. I think Mark is going to talk about some of the math that's required to make that work. And spoiler alert, we may not be quite there in terms of the number of units and people that are going to be living here according to this plan to make that actually financially viable. And that's important for a number of reasons, but Mark is going to explain that. I'd be curious to know what I think the standard for the remaining lands is 20%, the privately owned lands. I'm curious to know how we can ensure that we at least get that on privately owned lands. I know that there's also a site on the west side of the island referred to as the Esrock site, which Councillor, Paula Fletcher has mentioned there may be an opportunity to explore some additional housing there. So I'm curious to know what that could look like. And then there's the issue, so enough about buildings. There's the issue of the public realm and the municipal right-of-ways, right? So the draft plan contemplates 4 street typologies with right-of-way widths varying between 19 and 40 meters. Of these, most of them are 19 or 20 meters. So you've got these pedestrian-only streets. You've got pedestrian priority streets. You've got local streets. They're all 19 to 20 meters, right? In all cases, I generally have no concern regarding the planned right-of-way width because I think it's also important to note that the width is one thing, but what is more important is what happens inside of that space, right? So we're not building 20-meter wide roadways with 4 or 5 vehicular lanes, right?
Kane Bajok.
Yeah. So
Kane Bajok. Charlie and Augie, sit down. Sit.
Sorry, could you please
Hey,
mute
Charlie.
yourself? Sorry, hello. Somebody needs to mute themselves, please. Thank you so kindly. Thanks very much for that. Please make sure you're on mute.
I'm not used
Okay.
to being told to
I
sit
don't know who that
during the
is.
presentation. That's a first for me.
I just went to 0.
Okay.
I went to
I don't know who that is.
I found
Whoever
him.
that is out there, can you please mute yourself? Someone is interrupting our talk, and we're thrilled you're here with us. Please mute yourself. So check to make sure. Okay. Thank you.
So I mean, in all cases, I don't have any major concerns with any of the sort of the more narrow right-of-ways. I think the one thing I'd say is that we've identified the potential for additional setbacks occurring on private land or publicly owned land for that matter on the adjacent development blocks. And I question the need for that and the extent of that that's required, especially because many of the public sidewalks adjacent, these development blocks they're 3 to 4 meters wide. And if you include the planting and tree areas, they're more like 5 or 6 meters wide. So, you know, I question that, you know, do we really need additional setbacks? And if so, how much? And maybe we should be looking in terms of maximums instead of minimums, because I think there's this need really to sort of maintain an appropriate sense of scale, to create a sense of comfort, enclosure, and appropriate human scale. And that we can start to lose that if we're not careful about the proportions a little bit. So I would leave that with people to think about. Yeah, and then in terms of there's you know, Munition Street that has a planned right of way of 30 meters, and then Commissioners is 40, and New Cherry Street is 42. I mean, and again, I say the same thing. It's not how wide they are; it's what's going into them, right? And I'm less concerned with Commissioners, honestly. I don't have any major concerns with Cherry, other than I would say I think my understanding is that Cherry is intended to be the street that has kind of at grade retail on both sides, and what we have seen on Front Street East, you know, actually not far from where Eric lives, and other places, it can actually be difficult for retail to thrive and survive in conditions where the right of way is so wide and the facing condition is so significant. If you don't create that sort of intimate Main Street feeling, it can be very challenging economically for retail to survive. So that's maybe something to think about. Munition Street, the only thing I'd say is I don't think it needs to have as many vehicular lanes. It's got 3 vehicular lanes. You know, so I do sort of question the need for that. I think we could tighten that up potentially a little bit. So I think again, I don't think it's any like significant changes I would even propose at this point. I think it's more just you know, urban acupuncture, you know, small interventions, tighten things up just a little bit. You know, like the only other critique I've got is of the pedestrian only street, the old Cherry Street. And really, you know, it's not intended for vehicular traffic, but it has to have a fire route. So we've got a fire route, but then we have designated sidewalks on either side of it. Do we really need that? I mean, doesn't the fire route sort of act as the pedestrian clearway in and of itself? And we have a condition, it's a 19-meter wide array, and then but the planting and landscape zones actually falls outside of that, and we're reliant on the, you know, collaboration with the adjacent development to actually facilitate that. And bring it into the public realm. It's not actually included in the public right of way. But if we didn't have, you know, 6 meters of sidewalks on either side of the fire route, we could facilitate that. We'd have space for it. You know, we could tighten things up. We also don't need a curb if it's you know, a pedestrian only street and it has a curb. You know, so I think there are things like that I would think to maybe start to revisit a little bit. Beyond that, yeah, Norm mentioned the community services and facilities. So just very quickly, new community center, new elementary school, new childcare facility, new public library. I'll echo Norm's ambition and hope and aspirations that these should be structurally integrated into mixed-use developments, and we should be making the best use of this land. We should not, in downtown Toronto, be building standalone community service and facilities buildings. And so I do hope that that's part of the plan, and I don't know definitively. But I'd say, you know, the plan does a lot of things right. An incredible opportunity for you know, enhanced Indigenous placekeeping, creating spaces for all 4 seasons, a variety of active and passive recreational uses. You know, it has a significant amount of parkland being dedicated to it, again because it falls into a floodplain. So that's a tremendous amenity for the community, and it's going to be Toronto, or at least it's planned to be Toronto's first climate positive neighborhood. So I think that's incredible if we can actually achieve that. So I think this, in the long and short of it, I'd say, is from my perspective as a planner and urban designer, I think this plan does a lot of things right, but I think there are places where we can continue to push and make it just perhaps that much better. And I'll leave you with that.
Thank you very much for that, Blair. Very much appreciated. I note that we have a comment from Heather Jordan noting that she felt that the streets are wider than Spadina is. And I think maybe Heather may just be referring to Commissioners. I know that Commissioners is set to be wide. Of course, it's supposed, if my understanding, is it the same as yours, Blair, that the Commissioners is meant to contain the main LRT route east-west, is it not? Oh, yeah, hang on. Let me unmute you here. Okay. See, that's what happens when you okay. There you go. There you go.
Yeah, to provide a bit of context, so the biggest street contemplated here is New Cherry, and it's 42 meters. Commissioners is 40 meters. But bear in mind, the south side of Commissioners is just open space and parkland, right? We're not creating a street-facing condition on both sides. For context, University Avenue, I think, is at or slightly above 45 meters. Spadina Avenue is 36 meters. St. Clair Avenue ranges from 27 to 30 meters. The central segment of Eglinton is 27 meters. Bay is 27 meters. Danforth is 27 meters. And portions of Bloor vary between 20 and 27 meters. So, the space is bigger than what I would expect to see in sort of more this sort of older elements of the urban fabric that were maybe not designed for cars specifically, or to accommodate a broad range of modal splits, like what we're seeing. Like, we have dedicated facilities on these streets for pedestrians, for cyclists, for vehicles, and for light rail transit. So, one question is, do we need to segregate everything? Do we need to segregate it to the extent that we are planning to? Might there be opportunities to tighten things up and share right-of-way space in certain circumstances? And I think these are all very reasonable questions to be asking.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. Thank you. And I guess that we're going to lead into Mark Richardson. Mark, I'm just going to spotlight you, and I'm going to ask you to unmute. And welcome. Oh, hang on. If you could, there you go. Hi, Mark.
Hello. Can you see
Welcome.
my slides? Can you unmute me? Can you see me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, and I can see your slide.
Okay. So first, thank you to Ed and the folks at Waterfront for All for inviting us to participate today, and to Norm and to Blair and to Eric for teeing up the ball pretty well on what we are going to be talking about today. HousingNowTO.com is an open data, open government transparency organization that has been tracking affordable housing developments within the city of Toronto since 2018. We have a consistent pattern in the city of Toronto in undersizing our affordable housing projects, having them struggle, having them not complete, and then coming back around later and adding more heightened density to make the math work. We would like Villiers to break that mold. We would like to set the ambitious targets and set the servicing requirements for those ambitious targets on the front end, so we don't have to go back and fix it again later. Perfect example is, say, Regent Park. Regent Park phases 1, 2, and 3 were in the mid-20 heights. Now in 2024, phases 4 and 5 are getting into the 40 and the 50-story heights in order to generate that. If we look at some of the Housing Now sites that we've dealt with, the site at 150 Merton in Midtown near Davisville subway station, the city started it at 15 stories. We ran the math on it and said, there's no way CMHC is funding that less than about 26 or 27 stories. The city said maybe 18 stories. The city then awarded it to an Indigenous seniors housing organization and their development partner. And they've just come back in the last 12 months and said, now we need 29 stories. So it would have helped us 5 years ago if we'd have just had the 26-story discussion then. Construction costs would have been lower, interest rates would have been lower, and we would have only had to have one round of meetings with the neighbors rather than 3 rounds of meetings. The neighbors were mad about the 15, they were mad about the 18, and we wasted all this time and energy getting the neighbors mad about buildings that were never actually going to get built. So if we're going to break people's hearts, let's break hearts with the facts of what we're going to need on these sites. So the city of Toronto has a history of doing things where they break their own rules. The Bloor Danforth Viaduct was built over 100 years ago. They put extra money and extra engineering into that viaduct 50 years before a subway line ever ran across. Somebody was making a future-facing decision to over-engineer a piece of infrastructure in order to have a future benefit as the city grew. We are incredibly timid as a city. We are literally afraid of our own shadow. How do we go back to that mindset that we had 100 years ago, where you over-engineer something now so you have more opportunities for future growth later? Another example is even the area around the St. Lawrence district. St. Lawrence district, if you go back and look at 1974 when that was announced, that district was contaminated lands down by the railroad track that nobody wanted to live near. And the city, much like the Portlands, was able at that time to throw out the rule book. The rule book at that time said you need to build things in a certain way. The city changed that. St. Lawrence broke a bunch of rules. They built schools with housing directly above them. They built libraries with housing directly above them. The challenge is now, it's 50 years later, if we want to still build on these kinds of lands in those kinds of locations in downtown Toronto, we're not putting 10 and 12-story buildings above the school. We're putting 30 and 40-story towers above them. And so breaking the rules, over-engineering now to allow for future growth is sort of an intrinsic part of what we're doing. And the reason we're doing that is because we have to spread the costs around in order to be able to deliver the affordable housing that we want to build. So I'm going to jump through a couple of slides here to talk about what we mean when we talk about government-supported affordable rental housing in Toronto in 2023. So this chart is the housing spectrum. It runs from emergency shelters and transitional housing through social housing or TCHC with rent geared to income, through co-ops, through workforce housing and below market rental, through to purpose-built rental, through to affordable ownership, attainable ownership, and single family homes. I'm here to tell people there are going to be no more affordable single family homes within the border of the city of Toronto. So let's take that off the table to begin with. When we're looking at Villiers, we're really only looking at the condo through the workforce housing and maybe a little bit of co-op. The average household income within the city of Toronto in 2021 was $84,000 a year. So $84,000 a year means if you're using the CMHC standard of 1/3 of your before tax income is the maximum you should spend on rent or mortgage, that means you shouldn't spend more than $2,100 a month on rent, no matter the size of your unit. So if, let's say that we're talking about a 500 square foot, 1-bedroom apartment, that's coming in at $2,100, is coming in at $4 a square foot in monthly rent. That's about average. Maybe it's closer to 5 in along the waterfront in some of those new buildings. But getting a 900 square foot 3-bedroom apartment for $2,100 a month, you're going to have to apply a much larger amount of subsidy. And that's for a median worker. That's $84,000 a year household income. That's a nurse. That's a paramedic. That's somebody with a professional designation. That's not a Tim Hortons employee or a security guard or, you know, the kinds of people who do the sorts of jobs that help make our city operate. So if you go half of our household income, you're at $42,000 a year. With the city of Toronto, in our rent geared to income pool, where actually most of our people who are in TCHC, and we'll talk about this in a second, their incomes are under $20,000 a year. Their average rent per month that they can afford out of pocket is under $500 a month, no matter the size of their unit. There is no discount for building an affordable housing building. Cement costs the same whether you are a private sector developer, a public sector developer, a co-op, a charity. You're paying the same for cement. You're paying the same for windows. There are no magical plumbing elves who come in the night to install all your fixtures. You pay them the same union wage as anybody else. In fact, on most of the city projects, you pay more because the people who are allowed to bid on the city projects is a smaller pool of available workers. So in the city of Toronto right now, in TCHC social rent geared to income housing, the average household income, like I said, is about $19,000 a year. This is from their 2023 annual report. Some examples of people who are paying based on their family circumstances between $226 a month and $677 a month, with the average being $485 a month in rent. The only way you create units on Villiers at that size and scale and at that rent is with huge direct subsidy from government. You either pay for that unit up front in cash, and then you turn it over to TCHC for management, or to your co-op or your not-for-profit for management, or you provide that household with a $2,000 a month rent voucher to offset the construction cost. So there's been a bunch of changes over the last 5 years. We've had 2 mayors. We unexpectedly had an extra mayor. So the original plan in 2020 under John Tory's plan was that they were going to create 40,000 new units of housing by 2030. Then last fall, after Olivia Chow was elected, there was an additional of another 25,000 additional units, including 2,500 of them as rent geared to income. So right now we have a revised target for units to be delivered by December 31st, 2030 of 65,000 new city-led housing units. Of the Housing Now sites that John Tory announced in December 2018, we've so far broken ground on 1 of them. So this is where, if we're serious about getting to this number, we need to do things at a speed and a scale and a cost that will make people uncomfortable. If we're not willing to make people uncomfortable, if we're not willing to break our rules, then let's stop talking about the 65,000 units number. Let's stop talking about the 2,500 new RGI units number. Because when we go to CMHC, it is the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Our projects get measured against what it costs to build a unit in Mississauga, what it costs to build a unit in Montreal, what it costs to build a unit in Calgary, what it costs to build a unit in Vancouver. And if I am the federal government, I'm looking for bang for my buck. If I do not provide bang for my buck and certainty of delivery, I'm going to give the money to the cities that can do that. So we are competing for resources to solve our local affordable housing problem. We have to be competitive, and we have to be innovative, and to a certain degree, we have to be entrepreneurial in our approach to delivering affordable housing. And instead, we have a very bureaucratic, process-bound, everyone defers to everyone system. And that's how we end up with some of the challenges we have today. So this is just another visual of that 65,000 number and what's in it and what's not in it. The Housing Assessment Resource Tool is a project we work on at University of British Columbia. They look at how many affordable housing units need to be created for what kinds of incomes based on census and household need. So we're just talking in these stats about City of Toronto proper. We're not talking about the census district that goes out all the way up to Barrie and out to Mississauga. This is just the City of Toronto census subdivision. So this is your number from the 2021 census. We need to create 210,000 units that rent below $1,700 a month in 2021 numbers. And people, I can see some of the folks' eyes got wide at that number. So even if we do the nearly impossible thing that the city is trying to do of 65,000 units by 2030, we will still be less than a third of the total units we needed in 2021. And those units will probably still be too expensive for the lowest income earners. So we want to create affordable housing. We want to create workforce housing. We want to create social housing, seniors housing, student housing, all of these things. But in order to do that, we need to get off our asses and change how we do things in the city of Toronto and at Queen's Park and federally and with agencies that are responsible to all and none of these groups. So Joe Berridge is from Urban Strategies. He's one of the founder of Urban Strategies. He wrote a great book during COVID called Perfect City. And it talks about how different cities around the world struggle with their challenges. And it has what I think is the best description of Canadian intergovernmental relations and the best description of the challenge that an organization like Waterfront Toronto has, because it is a tripartite organization made up of the feds, the province, and the city of Toronto. So Joe says the enemy is always the blob, the congealed mess of outdated and overlapping jurisdictions, the diffuseness of responsibility, and the fact that simultaneously no one and everyone is in charge. There is no better description of trying to get affordable housing built in the city of Toronto than this quote from Joe. So I'm going to quickly just bounce. These slides are sort of a highlight reel of some of the stuff that Norm talked about earlier. These are straight slides from the folks at Waterfront Toronto. And we're just going to kind of highlight some of where we think the challenges are on the affordable housing side. First of all, if you can see my logo, my icon here, I want you to notice these ghostly buildings that don't really exist in the middle of Villiers Island. Those are the private lands in the middle of Villiers Island. When in doubt, Waterfront Toronto should be acting more like a private land developer than a public sector, let's make everybody happy developer when it comes to dealing with the city, urban design, built form, and how they're going to, if we want to maximize the affordable housing, we have to monetize the land we own. And we have been told very clearly in 2018 and 2019, in the early days of the Housing Now program, when we were questioning how they were going to make some of these sites work on other places around the city that were too small, we were clearly told by senior people in the chief planner's office, economic viability is not a planning consideration. If we are going to deliver and maximize the affordable housing on Villiers Island, then economic viability is the primary planning consideration. Otherwise, we just draw a bunch of pretty pictures that nobody ever builds, and then we're going to have to come back site by site and make changes to it block by block. We clearly don't have the time or the money or the staff to screw around like that. So let's not do that. Let's set a standard, let's bite the bullet, and let's do the hard things now for the future benefit of the city, like they did when they were building the Danforth Viaduct. So Norm showed a bunch of this stuff already. I really wanted to sort of hit on some of the housing. The highlights on this are ours. So this was a 2017 plan. So it was approved in 2017. The 2017 plan really started discussions probably 2014, Norm, the first meetings, 2 or 3 years. So the most important thing to remember, back in 2014, Toronto didn't have a housing crisis. I mean, there may have been homeless people, there may have been people who were living in bad TCHC units, but the housing crisis hadn't moved far enough up the economic spectrum that it had any political power. It was only when teachers and nurses and university students from good families were having trouble finding places to live that it gained some political clout. We always had a housing crisis, but these numbers in 2017 were not serious. when we were raising these concerns in 2014, 2015, well, at that time I was on the City of Toronto's planning review panel under Jennifer Keesmaat. We were kind of patted on the head and told, you know, economic viability isn't a planning consideration. Well, this number of units on this much land with this many billions of underground infrastructure doesn't make any financial sense if I'm going to go to CMHC and ask them for money. If I'm only going to do 20% of the units, I'm only going to get 850 units out of it. And designing anything in the City of Toronto in 2017 even as a primarily a mid-rise community, like the cost of getting out of the ground, particularly on somewhere with as many engineering and water table challenges as Villiers Island, you can't do a mid-rise community. We tried to have these conversations then. Those conversations were unwelcome at that time. Thankfully, we are now getting new directions, and we're seeing this even here. I mean, this development is over in the West Donlands. If you look at this development in the West Donlands, or the new development, I think it's block 13 in the West Donlands, it blows through all of the West Donlands master plan from before the Pan Am Games. Some of the sites in the West Donlands have required ministers' zoning orders in order to execute at a speed and a scale that CMHC would be willing to fund them. What we're saying on Villiers is, can we save ourselves that future pain of having to rezone, having to MZO, by being much more aggressive, much more financially savvy when we're defining these sites now on Villiers. So this is the donut picture, as we call it. So the city says, this is Waterfront Toronto, they have a goal of maximizing housing opportunities on public lands. I'd say the only people who are actually maximizing the housing opportunities on their lands are the people in the middle here who own the private lands. Because even back in 2017, if I, let me just see if I can share this. So this is, can you guys see that okay? Do I need to zoom it in? So this is the 309 Cherry, the private land. Even back in 2017, those guys were talking about 47 stories and 39 stories. They were being serious back then at the same time as we were talking about a mostly mid-rise design style. Across the board, we should have been talking about this kind of height and density on the city-owned parcels, on the government-owned parcels back then. Now we're playing catch-up, and we're still only slightly getting towards the 39 stories. So I'm just going to skip through a bunch of these slides to show the comparison. So this was a 2017 with the ghostly images in the middle. There is, you'll see this repeating again and again. They put the height and the density closer to downtown, and it drops off as it gets further east. Your challenge is you do have the runways at the airport. So even though these buildings are outside of the current approaches, there's nothing to say that in a few years, some design standard doesn't change for airport approaches, and that has an impact. If I just show you this building, these are the two buildings in the middle here. So they're about the halfway point on the island. And if I go full screen, can you guys see that okay? So from the end of the runway to where those 309 Cherry buildings would be is about 3.3 kilometers, or just around about 2 miles. So I can guarantee you that the private sector developer is building all the way they can to the edge of the flight path limits. That's when they put that proposal in 2017, that's obviously what they would do. It's also not a direct line, right? Like the runway actually doesn't really go out direct straight line over Villiers. It's an angle approach because you have to have like a sort of a funnel shape. So we're going to pull the most recent approach paths, but you do have a lot of clearance between the end of the runway and even where the start of the city's buildings are here. We also think that there's definitely an opportunity to make all of that stuff on the other end taller than it was in the original plan. So this is the new comparison between the 2017 and the 2024 plan. So the 2017 is on your left, the 2024 is on the right. They're still doing this mid-rise heights with short towers on the east block. Our concern is we do not see how any affordable housing in large quantities gets created at that kind of scale. So if the city's goal is maximizing the delivery of affordable housing, you have to maximize the delivery of all housing because it is the total quota of housing that lets you accomplish that 20 to 30% goal. Every building costs X dollars to get out of the ground. Every time it comes out of the ground, you need to squeeze that lemon as hard as you can to generate as much residential GFA, as many apartment units as you can on every shovel you put in the ground. And the more economically challenged you are by having to provide units that are at a very low rent, you're going to have to squeeze that lemon even harder, or you're going to have to really hope that the federal government, whoever that might be in 2026 or 27, really wants to put billions of dollars into social housing in the city of Toronto when nobody voted for them. So, you know, this is how we think you should, the Waterfront Toronto should be approaching this, is taking the model that is this grayed out ghostly parcel in the middle and using it as the model for almost the entire island. Maybe not as tall, but the amount of GFA or gross floor area it generates. Like Blair was saying, 750 square meter floor plates were not handed down to us by Moses on stone tablets. They were passed by City Council in 2013. It makes sense that in 2017, we treated them like they were important rules that needed to be maintained. We didn't have a housing crisis. Good affordable housing buildings, if you want large family sized units, you want wheelchair accessible units, you want units that are highly accessible for people who need motorized scooters and lifts to get in and out of the bathroom and in and out of their beds. Those are 1,000 square meter floor plates to start. And we used to build those a lot in the past. We just don't build them anymore. So now we're talking about maximizing the housing opportunities on public lands. The city has gone from 4,500 to 9,000 units. Our analysis before this plan was that we could not make the CMHC math work under 12,000 units. So if you want 30% of the units to be in some spectrum of affordability for an extended period of time, say 99 years, you need to be hitting the kinds of units per acre, apartments per acre, that the successful Housing Now sites are accomplishing. Not the ones that were approved and haven't been built yet. You have to model yourself on the buildings that are being built. So the most important thing here is we've got these 38 and 45 story, 48 story buildings, yet here on the east end, we're doing 13, 14, and 24. The reason for that is, our understanding is it might throw a shadow on the wetlands if we go taller, and we've spent a lot of money building these wetlands and parks. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of people in this city sleeping in parks, please go and ask any of them if they'd rather be in the shadow of a building in a park, or if they'd rather be inside a new, larger building, being able to live in a new affordable unit because we took this 14-story building and we made it 32 stories. Or because we took this 24-story building and instead of doing the 750 square meter floor plate, we doubled the floor plate on this and we created a 1,500 square meter floor plate on the 24-story tower. Shadows, you know, should not be the thing that is driving our decisions during a housing crisis. Figure out the math, then figure out the nice to haves later on. So these are the shadow heights and stuff. You know, some very nice render porn. We spend a lot of time and money drawing pretty pictures of things. There's never somebody living in a tent in any of these parks, but there is in the real world. So let's get our priorities right and tackle this. And this is how you contact me, and I'm happy to go back to the panel and answer questions about how we deliver affordable housing at speed and at scale in the real world on Villiers Island.
Thank you very much for that, Mark. I really, really appreciate that. I'm going to spotlight our panel, and here we are. We'll take questions in the chat, and we may be able, if people know how to raise their hands, may be able to accommodate some questions. I'm just going to go to our chair of Waterfront for All, Ed Hoare. Hi, Ed. If you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, I have nothing to ask, just to thank all the speakers for what I thought was a really thought-provoking presentation. I think there's others probably more qualified with more interesting questions than I would have. So I'll pass.
Okay, thanks for that, Ed. I appreciate that. So yeah, if you have questions in the chat, I know a couple of, now one, you know, I'm just going to catch this up because there have been some comments. One thing, and I honestly don't know the answer to this. There was a question about how far Waterfront Toronto had gotten in terms of infrastructure, underground infrastructure planning, and how that would constrain surface street planning and changes perhaps to that. I don't know. Blair,
Our understanding, and Blair may be able to speak more directly to it, is as of today, there are not a single foot of new water pipe or sewer pipe has yet to be run under Villiers Island. There is a new sewage containment or some sort of building just south of the railroad tracks, sort of at the bottom of Cherry Street there. That is being used, and I don't know what the capacity challenges are there, but this is where we were talking about the Bloor Viaduct as the example. This is the place where you now want to potentially over-engineer the water and sewer capacity in that neighborhood in order to allow for greater growth later on in the future. We could also set different water standards on Villiers. It is a blank slate. We could say this is a gray water, low flow toilet standard neighborhood with certain kinds of shower heads so that we are not using as much water per unit as an old 1960s slab tower apartment in the middle of Scarborough used. This is a blank slate. We need to treat it as a blank slate and be creative to think around those problems.
You know, I think about what you just said something interesting. I know you're talking about floor plates. You know, I think about we tend to not love perhaps the old slab apartments that are mostly in places like Scarborough, and yet you know my eldest son's grandparents who came to Canada as political refugees in the Chilean coup, and they, when they moved to Toronto, lived in one of those buildings, you know, near Lawrence and Midland, right? And it was a large 3-bedroom
1,500
apartment
square
in a
feet.
slab tower.
Yep.
Yep, with a balcony and 2 bathrooms.
Yeah. And they're not just out in Scarborough, right? They're in the annex, but we just stopped building them in 1972, and now we're paying for that sin with our current housing challenges.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I lived for 20 years in a co-op in St. Lawrence that was 1,000 square feet, right? Built 35 years ago, 30 or 36 years ago. So do we have questions?
Blair, you got your hand
Blair.
raised? I think you have to unmute him.
Unmute yourself. There you go.
So I was just
I did.
add to what Mark was saying in an attempt to respond to the question about municipal servicing. And sorry, I can hear my child screaming in the background now. When undertaking like a master servicing plan for a precinct, or when doing the servicing work for a policy plan, like a secondary plan, engineers are always, very mindful of the need for buffer. So there's, we need to be, we have a little bit of flexibility on the transportation side of things. We can encourage people to take active transit, public transportation, et cetera. But we have difficulty regulating how many people are going to be flushing toilets. If we don't size the infrastructure appropriately, we're going to have a problem. So on the servicing side of things, the tendency is to always build in a bit of a buffer beyond, what the plans or targeted population and job count is for an area or a precinct or a district, to accommodate for some degree of flexibility. So I guess there was some work that was undertaken on the servicing side of things to determine what sort of volume of capacity was required to accommodate this plan in 2017. My understanding from the most recent round of work that went looking into the densities is that these revised densities work with the previously planned servicing infrastructure. So I guess if I had a question at this point, it would be, what remaining buffer exists? Is there sufficient buffer to further push the density, or do we reach a threshold beyond which at some point we need to then revisit the servicing capacity that's planned and look at increasing it? To Mark's point, it's always better to sort of future-proof our plans and build additional capacity up front than it is to try to retrofit things later on. So this plan is going to council, the precinct plan is going to council with the draft OPA, draft ZBA in June. I don't believe that there's realistically any time between now and then to revise the servicing infrastructure plan. So whatever decision is made in June will be based off of those previous servicing numbers. But that's not to suggest that we can't have this conversation. There couldn't be opportunities to sort of increase the capacity through subsequent phases of this work.
It's interesting you should say that, right?
Sorry, Edward.
Go ahead. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Norm. No, it's just sorry. It just popped up in the chat. Someone said, "Do panelists?" And maybe you can. This is a little segue back to you, Norm. Do panelists have thoughts on how we might continue forward at pace through council and then leverage the design processes and stages with Waterfront Toronto to make some changes, such as right-of-way setback conditions, east block height increases, and building design changes? So can we go forward and still do it?
Yeah,
I would definitely encourage people to come out and delegate and speak up for the city that you want to see and the island that you want to see. More Neighbors has some great tools for getting going on that, and you can follow Housing Now as well. Just further to the last point before I pass it on, I understand the city is looking for some certainty in terms of the number of units. Hopefully, that's not like an urgent thing, and we can continue to refine this plan and make it better.
Yeah.
Mark?
Yeah, so the question about how do you do this, I would like to see City Council actually tell staff that they have a prime directive, like in Star Trek. Your prime directive is to maximize the delivery of affordable housing. Right now, legislatively, public art gets more money dedicated and set aside than affordable housing does, because there is a policy at the City of Toronto. Was it, Blair? 1.5% of the total value of the project goes to a public art fund.
Yeah,
something like that. There's zero equivalent. So like, we've spent 30 years creating policies that we never said affordable housing is a city priority.
Yeah.
The well that was built on the old Globe and Mail lands at the bottom of Spadina and Front there are 1,700 units of housing in there. There's zero affordable housing. And that was not that there was zero community benefit extracted from that. There were hundreds of millions in community benefit. But in 2016, when that deal was being done by progressive councillors, Joe Cressy was the local councillor at the time. Jennifer Keesmaat was the chief planner at the time, I think. The money went to build a fancy new YMCA up the street. It didn't go to affordable housing. So this is where we need to say to staff, if we need a new rec center, if we need a new library, the property taxpayers will pay for the new rec center and the new library. If we need affordable housing, the prime directive that you're being given is to generate the affordable housing out of the community benefits. And we'll make the rest of the city, the entirety of the city or of the region, pay for the additional pieces that are required for that complete community. If affordable housing isn't your number one priority, then it won't get delivered in the quantities we need it to be delivered in.
Eric, then back to Blair.
Yeah, I think, the question about whether or not there's still time to influence outcomes at Villiers, there still is. So in my dialogue with Waterfront, which was actually last Friday, they indicated that right now the biggest barrier to density, and Blair, I think we'll see where we also land on the infrastructure piece, is the transportation. That they just don't think right now the plan with the Eastern LRT is going to be able to support that much more population density based on their assumptions. And the big contributor to improving that is not going to come from the city, it's going to come from the province. So how do you do that? I think the biggest thing is this needs a champion from the city to press the province to say, we want to build a lot more housing and infrastructure here. We lack the transportation. You have two opportunities, one in the Ontario line and another in the GO tracks that run north of this development to bring rapid transit connection to service this area. And that will be the biggest contributor to Waterfront being able to go beyond the density. In terms of the built form, while there is plans around infrastructure, a lot of the way that these streets look is still up for debate. Even in my conversation with them, they're not planning Center Street, I believe is what they're calling it right now, to be a totally straight street. So there are opportunities for how to change the public realm, to change design. I think they could be more ambitious in how they work with the private developers to create a more cohesive space. I think they could be pressed on that. So, outside of some of the transportation planning on Commissioners and Cherry and some of this baseline infrastructure, the biggest things we can do is get the city to petition the province to update this site to access that rapid transit and to encourage Waterfront to look to urban models around pedestrianization, around shorter rights of way, etc., to really be able to do this. And Blair did a very good overview on some of the other orthodoxies we should be discarding as we think about this place.
Thanks, Eric. I was only just going to add, and I agree with all that. I was just going to add, to the question, to respond to the question. At this particular stage, I think, the precinct plan is exactly that. It's a plan. I'm not expecting that there's any likelihood or even potentially any need to revise it in principle at this point before this item goes to council or planning and housing committee and then council in June. But I think there are opportunities to incorporate some flexibility when actually drafting the official plan and policies themselves that are going to govern development in this area to future-proof and be less prescriptive, be more flexible and adaptable to changing circumstances. There are ways to write policy in that manner. I know from speaking, Mark and I and others have spoken with people of the city, spoken with people at Waterfront Toronto, obviously, and like we understand that they're already thinking in those terms. Now, have they gone far enough? That's a question. I mean, there may be things that we could be adding or staff could be adding to the text at this point to build in some additional flexibility at the zoning level and at the zoning level as far as regulations are concerned. And this is only the first part of the approvals process. There's going to be another a piece later on in the year where they're going to be looking at revising the public realm plan. And so with that comes the opportunity to finesse the right of way with their specific contents, potentially the facing distances. I saw the comment, Steve, from you in the chat. I totally agree. I mean, the facing distance condition between buildings is very important. What exactly that looks like, and opportunities to finesse, tweak, improve at that sort of stage. And then later on, and then there's a plan of subdivision that has to be developed. There's going to be further opportunity there, and then finally in a business plan, and then finally there's going to be the actual implementation on a block by block basis through a request for proposal process. And there's opportunity to write some language into the actual RFP documents themselves to promote a certain degree of flexibility and adaptability. So I think, yeah, there's opportunity to further finesse the plan as we move forward, and these just at a very high level are some of the ways in which we could be doing that.
Stephen Rowe suggesting he thinks that that both the Cherry GO station and a Cherry Ontario line station are problematic for a number of reasons, because of geometry, grade changes, and in one case, in closeness to East Harbor. I know there are folks who feel that those are some surmountable challenges. And I don't think Steve can join us except in the chat. But I mean, perhaps
making it easy to get from the east end. Sorry, it's Mark. Making it easy to get from the east end of the island, assuming the island was well developed, and getting those people to East Harbor, like that streetcar is supposed to eventually continue along Commissioners and then go up Broadview and like the later iterations of that LRT. But that LRT also needs to be probably in a fairly dedicated route and moving at pretty fast frequencies. Right. It's an engineering challenge if we say we're still going to have lots of cars on those routes as well and stuff.
Well, at risk of being exiled from Toronto, I can't help but being cheeky and point out that there are cities, I don't know, like Vancouver and Montreal, at least partially in Montreal, I should say, only the western part of the island, where they actually have dared to build above grade transit. I mean, Vancouver is filled with above grade transit, and somehow they managed to carry on. Burnaby didn't go up in flames because they have raised transit.
We're building it,
but somehow in Toronto we don't do that.
We're building it all along Eglinton. There's raised portions of the Eglinton Crosstown.
There's west. No, yes, but
yeah, and there's raised portions on the Ontario line up by the Science Center. Like it's
not without controversy.
Yeah, well, controversy, schmontroversy. Like at this point, we need to do things that people may find unpleasant to look at, but people sleeping in parks and under the Gardiner is also unpleasant to look at. So figure out which is more unpleasant.
I also think we find too many reasons.
Go ahead, Art.
I also think just in all these conversations, particularly anything that's city led, and maybe it's a Canadian trait, we find a lot of reasons to say why not. Why couldn't we do this like this way? Why couldn't we add this here? There's always a reason why we couldn't do something within the constraint of the box. But sometimes you also need to say, well, what if you were to blow this out a little bit more? How do you make it viable by increasing scale? And sometimes we don't have the gusto to ask that question, and we'd be better served more often if we did.
Right. Well, and of course, London.
Got a blank slate. We've got a blank slate here.
We do.
Dedicated right away for the streetcar. Don't need to mess with that with cars. Let's just do it right the first time.
Well, I was going to say, when London needed to extend transit in the Northeast, they built the overground, right? At vastly less cost than than extending the tube through that section of of the city. So I mean, the Elizabeth line in London, for those of you who've been to London recently, is lovely, but it was extraordinarily expensive. Just like in New York, extending the subway in the Upper East Side cost $1 billion a station. 4 stations, $4.2 billion. So US. So that's an entirely different issue, which is the cost of building transit in North America, vis-a-vis even other parts of Europe. I mean, and of course we see, when I mention Europe, simply because Europe is a high wage, rich economy culture with it's not so it's somehow in France and Germany they build transit for less. I'm not sure, I don't exactly know how they pull it off, but they managed to do it.
They do it about 1/5 the
because
cost that Toronto musters, for both above ground and below ground transit. And so I think one of the unspoken things that we don't talk a lot about in public procurement is some of the many hands in the popcorn that we've just called process, but isn't necessarily reflective of real global best practice. And to some extent, that falls on taxpayers, and it's a hard conversation to have.
And Eric, I think in fairness, it's similar. The US has similar issues in terms of cost structures. Would you not agree?
The US does, the UK and Australia as well. We've seen sort of the adoption of Anglosphere planning best practices, and we've had a hard time looking about how countries in Asia and mainland Europe are able to actually have institutions that are mandated to consistently and at scale build so that they can phase the types of capabilities in stronger public institutions instead of relying so much on consultants who have to price for the risk. And so we just have failed to adopt a better institutional model for building infrastructure.
Okay, just to pick up another point, I mean, we welcome all points of view. Listen to the questions: at what point density of housing becomes unhealthy or unsafe?
Compared to what?
Who wants?
I'm gonna take that one on. Compared to what? Like this idea. The people who talk about shoe boxes and dog crates and rat cages in the sky that we get at some of these meetings. And that may not be her comment in the thing. You're in a global high demand city. People want to be here. There are different kinds of housing crises around North America and around the Great Lakes. There, Cleveland and Cincinnati and Detroit and Toledo all have very different housing crises. Their housing crises are tens of thousands of abandoned homes that their government needs to pay to tear down because not enough people want to live there. So we have the right kind of housing crisis, which is we're an attractive global city with universities and hospitals and a multicultural society. It's our responsibility and our duty of care to make it, to create the spaces for the people who want to come here.
One thing I'd add to this, right, is overcrowding is what happens in a high demand market where people want to live and people are coming, and you don't build net new space for them to live, right? The way that you actually increase the standard of living for people is to build a marginally more space for them to live that is high quality. If you continue to build space for people to live, their living standards will not decline. So the whole goal is not about depriving living standards by building density, it's to raise living standards by building density. And I think that's what a lot of people in this conversation sometimes don't fail to grasp.
Because the rents get so high that you have intergenerational families with literally upwards of 20 people sharing a 3-bedroom apartment full of bunk beds. Because everybody's working a minimum wage job and they're in the north end of Etobicoke living in what is essentially a tenement building because there's or like you've seen the students living in basements in Scarborough near University of Toronto Scarborough campus where there are 5 bunk beds in a basement. If there's a health and safety issue, it's not about living in a tall building. It's about squeezing too many, like every person needs a certain amount of square footage. And as our population grows, we need to create more square footage. And we have these large sites. We have the Portlands, we have Downsview. We can grow into those areas. This Toronto is not full, right?
Yeah.
But
I mean, yeah,
go ahead.
I totally agree with what you're saying, Mark. And the other thing I would add is the opposite of density, which is sprawl, is terrible for the planet. Any environmentalist will tell you that. Building density is actually, and making communities where we can get around easily and not have to rely on the car. That is what's great for the planet. So, I think this is the healthy approach. You're seeing some sprawl in the province and building out for sprawl, and it's unfortunately very terrible for the planet. So,
and part of the reason why the buildings are getting so tall is because since 2013, we've squeezed the toothpaste tube on this 750 square meter floor plate. So buildings that you might think that's a nice building from the 1990s or the early 2000s, you take it to city planning and they say, you can't build that anymore. We have these new rules.
Well, I have to say something. I've lived in Toronto almost 40 years this August. I grew up in Victoria. I've been here for 40 years. I am, in fact, 10,000 years old. But people will say, Mark, I'm sure you've heard this, and Eric, Eric's, you're from a different generation than I am. But people will say, oh, why can't it be like Paris? Well, I was in Paris not that long ago. And as everyone who's been to Paris knows, there isn't a single detached house in the city of Paris.
Because they razed them.
You have to
they burned them to the ground.
Yeah. You have to get way out into Ile-de-France to find a single detached house. And even then you have to go pretty far. You'll see townhouses, you'll see semis, that sort of thing in the outer areas of Paris. But I mean, it's pretty much 5-7 story buildings everywhere.
If you made 8 stories,
so
if you made 8 stories by right on the entirety of the city of Toronto in every single residential neighborhood, not another tower would get built in the city. But until you're prepared to do that, we have to talk about density, and we have to talk about it at transit centers, and we need to talk about it at the opportunities we have that are blank sites, right? You don't get Paris on avenues, you get it on every street, or you don't get Paris.
Yeah, you don't get Paris. And of course, I mean, even Paris, even if you said tomorrow, like we made Eric the czar of Toronto, and just said, Eric, you could be czar. In order to achieve Paris, achieve a 21st century version of Paris, you would have to tear down a whole bunch of people's houses to do that, expropriate them all. It would cost billions. I mean, it's just, I think sometimes, I spent 26 years in the nonprofit co-op housing sector. And, we would constantly talk about, I remember when people would say to me, oh, why can't your co-op offer any more subsidized units? And I'd go, well, because actually we're an independent not-for-profit corporation, and we have to cover our costs, and we have a certain amount of external subsidy that we can apply that will allow us to give about 20-30% of our units to be rent geared to income, and otherwise we actually have to cover our costs. Like, it was still, now we were still able in the building I lived the longest, we were still able to offer lower than market for a whole host of interesting and great reasons, but we had to cover our costs. We couldn't, unless if our subsidy pool that we were then getting from the federal government was used up, that was it. We were done, right? We had to say, yeah, this is what it costs us to run this building. This is your proportional share. That's what this unit costs. And when there's nothing we can do about it, right? So I think that's another thing that I know, Mark, you've spoken to that very eloquently, but that's another thing too. And it's true, if you build more building, if you put more building, larger floor plates and more building in the same place. Oh, by the way, that co-op was a slab building, just FYI. It wasn't a point tower. Yeah, that was Windmill Line Co-op, right? I spent 20 years. But yeah, Do we have any more questions or comments that people would like to
I have a
share?
question or a comment that I know everyone will hate. I'm sure I'm wrong, but I just wanted to sort of put it out there that I note that neither the old plan nor the new plan for Villiers Island has any suggestion of workspace at all. I understand there'll be some retail. And of course, people have to live somewhere, and that's vitally important. But people have to work somewhere as well. Is it absolutely clear that housing should entirely edge out all workspace aside from the retail ground floor stuff? Or do we need some office space, that kind of stuff?
I'll take it.
Go ahead.
My preference would not be to mandate truly that much. I think each parcel should have some, economic case, even if it were to be developed in tandem with a partner. And if those partners think that a commercial component makes sense there, then they should be allowed. One of the things that I, would also point to is the East Harbor district just north of Villiers Island, which right now is forecast to have, I think, 50 million square feet of employment space. And as a result of that city imposed minimum, we're actually not creating that great of a place. And it's not clear that the demand for office space is even high. And that's going to be right at a transit node. So my preference would be, allow buildings to be mixed use, allow each building or the builder of that building decide who their market is and what mix they're going for, as long as they're including the thresholds that we set out for affordable housing, and let it make sense. But I don't think a strong commercial component to this site is going to end up making sense given the East Harbor just to the north.
Yes,
So I'll just add into that there is a large portion of employment use already going to be happening at like Parliament, like right at Cherry there. There's plans for further George Brown expansion. There is also plans for just on Villiers. There are going to be schools. There are going to be community centers. So when you talk about employment lands, it's not going to be another movie studio because we're already doing that 2 parcels over deeper into the Portlands. It's not going to be a soap factory. It might be an office building. I mean, East Harbor might have a lot of hotel and convention space because the city is really short on hotels. We're losing hotels. And it is really well transit served for all of our big sports venues. You're only 1 or 2 stops. And for our big convention centers, both at the exhibition and at Union. So when you say work, the work is much more likely to be services work, teachers, hotel workers, film people, than it is people who used to work in the soap factory or stuff on the old Unilever lands. Like those jobs are gone and they're never coming back to downtown Toronto. So it's a different kind of employment, and that has a different built form.
And we're unlikely to get a semiconductor factory there.
Right, but we might have lots of web designers and architects and people like that.
I'm sitting in my IT office right now. I'm pretty sure Eric's sitting in his and Norm's sitting in his.
Yeah.
Like, we all work remote now.
Yeah.
Blair, did you want to say something about that? Oh, you have to unmute yourself.
He's unable to.
Oh, there he is. He's got it.
Yeah, I guess just to sort of build upon some of the commentary already provided, I think we can't be looking at housing in isolation as obviously the only priority, right? What we're trying to create here is a complete community, right? And that's evident in the range of community services and facilities that are being offered. It's evident in the acknowledgement of there being some focus on ground floor retail. I do think we should be at an absolute minimum focusing on the types of services and goods that one would need part of their sort of daily or weekly routines. Within a reasonable walking distance, a 10 to 15-minute walking distance. Because this is an island, it is a little bit isolated in a sense. So ensuring that people don't have to leave the island to get their groceries would be ideal if we could manage that. To use the post office, to pick up their prescription at the pharmacy, to pick up the kids at daycare, etc. These types of things are really critical to ensuring the creation of complete and cohesive communities. So at an absolute minimum, yes, we need to bake that into the planning, and I do know that is top of mind for city staff and Creatio and Waterfront Toronto already. Beyond that, I think that to some points that have been made earlier. Generally, I'm in favor of deregulating things to a certain degree, and in terms of like finding ways to say yes with appropriate caveats. And it may be that you can design a building in such a way that maybe it is truly mixed use, and while it may be set up for residential uses from day one, there may be components of buildings that may be appropriate for conversion to alternative sort of non-residential uses if and when the demand arises, and they could seamlessly go back and forth from residential, non-residential without the requirements for structural alterations, major renovations. Similarly, we can be designing buildings for home occupations, right? And so I think there are things beyond pure residential that need to be considered in the process of planning for this community, and frankly any community at this point in the 21st century. So whether or not this is a major office market or not, that's a good question. But the points that have been raised, I think what I've mentioned, I think is sort of the top, should be, from my perspective, the top priority, acknowledging that major employment opportunities do exist and are planned nearby.
Absolutely. Just someone talked about just a quick comment. We're going to wrap up shortly, but just a quick comment from someone was mentioned in the chat talking about unique and small independent retailers and commercial services, and of course one of the challenges there is the affordability. I mean, and there's another affordability issue, which is the affordability of commercial space, right? I know it's something I remember a long time ago having a chat with Andrew Sorensen from U of T Scarborough when he and I were both at the Center for Social Innovation talking about the magic of the old strip malls in Scarborough, right? Because they provide comparatively affordable retail space, and replicating that in new buildings is extraordinarily difficult. Because new buildings cost a lot of money to build, and what have you, and also of course in private in purely private sector projects, people say, why is there a dry clean, why is there a Starbucks and a bank? And it's because, of course, part of that's reason is because retail spaces, when you're looking to get your construction loan from a giant bank, they know that chains can afford to pay the rent, and that they like that. They don't want, and they want to make sure that your space is going to actually return. It's one of those things. So creating affordable, I know there's going to be a little bit of an experiment with that, a small part of the Honest Eds redevelopment. But those are tiny pop-up spaces, as far as I understand it. But that is another challenge, right? How do you provide space in new and redeveloped areas for independent retail? I don't have an answer. I just know that's a question, right?
I think
something to also think about,
right? And like we lose this a lot is planning for flexibility, and sometimes the rules that we have in place don't enable flexibility. Like the retail guidelines are, quite stringent, and we see that some of the easiest things to do is just to replicate a design of retail units, even if they're not even that well designed, but because they've gotten approved before. And we don't think about, how do you add 2 retail units together if someone wants to expand? How do we enable someone to start small? A lot of the ways that we design ground floor architecture does not allow much customization. So we create places that aren't able to create, the textural scratch of head that a lot of small entrepreneurs want, like make a space that they have their own. And so they're going to even go for a more traditional space. So there are a lot of reasons why the limitations on what retail should look like make it hard for us to experiment with new retail designs and concepts. And I think that's why it's so important that we focus on flexibility, when we are thinking about how do we start with a blank space.
Thank you. Well, you know what? It is 9 o'clock. I want to thank all of our panelists for hanging in there with us for the entire session. Thank you, everyone, for showing up and attending. And now, is it June 13th? Is going to council or committee?
I believe that date
As
is
far as
right.
I know.
Yeah.
Okay, so for all of you who've attended this evening, yes, we have your emails, and yes, and we will flip that email. We'll post something at waterfrontforall.ca about that. We will also share that information if you want the link. And again, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Norm. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Blair, very, very much.
So
It's been a great pleasure having you with us this evening.
If people are
Mark, go ahead.
interested, this weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday at University of Toronto Scarborough campus, they're doing a 3-day affordable housing summit and skilled trades job fair and all sorts of stuff. We're going to be doing stuff on the Friday and the Sunday, but I'll make sure that, Edward, that you have it. And it should be a really good event. So if there are people who want to learn more about any of the kind of stuff that we're talking about here today, that affordable housing summit at University of Toronto Scarborough campus, we're expecting hundreds of people to be there this weekend, and it's free to attend.
And you know what? For those of you who are downtown or in the West End, you do not need a visa to go to U of T Scarborough. That is entirely a myth. And you can even get there on transit. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for all being with us. And we look forward to seeing you again really soon. Good night.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.